Thank you, Will. I appreciate that. So thank you everyone for taking time on this Wednesday afternoon to come and hear a little bit about this USGS-led project. We're really excited to share the results so far of this effort. It's been a wonderful opportunity to collaborate directly with Catherine's group at Fort, and I hope you see the great value linking the work they're doing with ours has made for this effort. I want to start us off with introducing the rest of the team. It's been a wonderful integrative team with lots of expertise that's gone into it's both technical and biological. And I won't take the time to read everyone's name, but you can see there on the screen all the contributions from these individuals, and we appreciate them bringing their talents to this project. So I'm going to lead off and hand it over to Ian Finksting, who's going to kind of talk a little bit about the this project as a whole, and then we'll move to Catherine to talk about some of the methods we used. So thank you much. Go ahead, Ian.
There we go. All right, thank you. Yeah, Will and Wes. Hi, everyone. This is the agenda briefly here. Again, the introduction I'll be covering, and then turn it over to Catherine for what we did, basically the methods, and then some of the results will be handled by Wes, such as the math products, risk analysis, tabular summaries, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to do some discussion. And yeah, if there's further interest in what this project is about that we couldn't cover in the the presentation, we'd be happy to talk about that some more. Okay, next slide. So I'll try to go over quickly, like the idea of what we're doing, so we can move on to more about the results and the methods and everything. So some of you, this might be your first time joining us on this call. We've had a few of these webinars in the past as we've been starting this project. This project actually was conceived around 2021 through funding through USGS and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so the idea was to focus on movement of taxa to the Northeast region. And if you saw the map on the first introduction or the title slide, the Northeast region is fairly generous, goes all the way to Kentucky. But the idea was to see where species might be moving into that region or within that region might be moving further due to changes in habitat suitability. And so that's going to happen all the time, but due to other factors such as the human alteration to the habitat or human-mediated movement, we are focusing not only on that aspect, but tied it in crucially with the effects from climate change. So the habitat itself changing and lowering the tolerance or lowering the requirement for these species to establish in these areas. The focus, if you look at the figure on the top corner, is in this smaller section on the far left bottom of the corner of the graph, far left corner, on the introduction phase and the prevention phase. And that's ideally where we want to focus our efforts, is because that's where you get lower control costs and smaller population sizes. So it's getting a sort of a risk assessment or idea of where these species might be moving to. So with the idea of limiting control costs and limiting the establishment. So that's pretty much that. So next slide. So how we went about this is focusing on where these species might be moving under changing conditions of the climate. We're expecting climate based off of various ensemble or various models and under ensemble averages of these models to generally shift northward, or the population shifting northward due to the suitability of the habitat trending in that direction as well. So latitudes shifting into higher, the population shifting to higher latitudes. And we could see that in some of the work that Catherine's group has looked at with other terrestrial species, terrestrial plant species, for instance. You can see on some of these figures here, some examples of these range shifts from maintained suitability to increasing suitability to decreasing suitability. So the focus is on this, for this project, is not so much on the terrestrial side, but more the aquatic side and the freshwater aquatic side. So we're looking at connectivity. We're looking at particular water bodies and streams. So large ponds, lakes, reservoirs, and then stream systems as well, and how those habitats might be affected under changing conditions. And the focus is species moving from the southeast to the northeast, or species moving from the Midwest region, highlighted in this sort of tannish beige color, to the northeast in the yellow color on the map there. And so yeah, we're I'll let Catherine go in depth into sort of the methodology, but sort of the general process is getting a knowledge of the life history of some of these species, what predictors or variables of the environment or the climate might be affecting the suitability or the establishment of these species in these new environments, and then running these model algorithms over the landscape with various landscape maps or habitat quality indicators that we can use to determine the suitability for these species in the not so distant future. And I think that's about it for that slide there, Wes. So I'll turn it over now to Catherine for what we've done. And I think, yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about how we underwent this project. So next slide. So here's kind of a overview of what we did within the project. So we started out by obtaining some input from a lot of you on this call related to what species you were interested in for this project, what kind of landscape features and environmental conditions you thought might be important and including in our analyses, and what kind of pathways we should consider in thinking about risk of movement of species across the landscape. And so after we got that input, we obtained occurrence locations for the species that were requested and developed a suite of environmental predictors for freshwater aquatic environments. And then we fed those into a modeling framework that we developed for terrestrial plant species modeling. And so we had a lot of code and processes and analyses already set up that we adapted to these aquatic environments. So we fit habitat suitability models. We underwent model review of these to looking at each model for each species and thinking about whether or not the predictions that we were making and the environmental relationships we were fitting, did they make ecological sense? Did they make biological sense for that species? And once we decided that that was the case, then we could apply those models to future scenarios and develop future suitability maps, and then also try to incorporate pathway risk, so the spread of species on top of those. And then these are going to be served in a interactive web application. Next slide. So what was the project scope again? So as I mentioned, we've done a lot of work in terrestrial environments. So we had a terrestrial template that we used for those models, and we wanted to develop something similar for freshwater systems. And also in thinking about freshwater systems and what environmental characteristics might be important for habitat suitability, we decided it was important to keep lakes and streams separate because there could be different factors influencing what might be important habitat characteristics for a species in those two different systems. So we used the NHD plus HR database to define lakes and to define streams. And so I have a zoomed in version here showing kind of the integration of that terrestrial template with the lakes and streams. Next slide. And then here's another example, just looking at what we're calling streams, so the features from the NHD plus with moving water versus lakes, so more kind of standing water. Next slide. So what species did we end up considering for this project? So there were 111 species requested by project partners, and these included species across 3 different broad taxonomic groups, including fish, invertebrates, and plants. And then around the edges, we have listed different data sources that we used for the occurrence data for those species. Next slide. So while we identified 111 species that models were desired for, we really only had enough data to create models for 91 of those species. So 19 of them didn't have enough data. And what does that mean? To create a model, we required there to be at least 50 occurrence locations that were spatially separated. So for lakes, we required there to be, or we only allowed a single occurrence point within a single lake. And for streams, we only allowed a single occurrence point within a stream reach. And so there had to be at least 50 lakes with an occurrence point or 50 stream reaches with an occurrence point. Of those 91 species that we modeled, there were enough locations in lakes and streams for 73 of them. For 4 of them, there was only enough data in lakes, and for 15, there was only enough data within streams. Next slide. So what kind of information did we use to describe the environment? So as we've said, we're interested in how these species might shift with climate. So one of the important factors was climate variables. So we had both current and future conditions for those. There were several variables that were more static that we only had current predictions for, so something like topography. And then we used soils information to try to get somewhat at water chemistry conditions. We also had land use classification, both current and future predictions. And for annual stream flow, we had a future prediction for that predictor as well. Next slide. So there were several more terrestrial predictors that we applied to water bodies as surrogates for information that we didn't have. For example, cropland. And so the way that we did this was taking kind of the smallest hydrologic unit, the HUC 12, and summarizing to that area. Next slide. So here's an example of that. Like on the bottom, we're showing the percent crop land cover again within a HUC 12. And so we could apply that value from that HUC 12 to the individual lake. And these were provided terrestrial proxies known to affect water chemistry. Next slide. And then thinking about the future potential conditions for the land use and the stream flow, we only had a single prediction for the future. But for the climate data, we had data from 5 different future scenarios, different global circulation models. And based on input from previous webinars, we decided to do a future ensemble condition across these 5 and provide some information about uncertainty. Next slide. I'm going to pass it on to Wes now to talk about some of the products that we produced from this work.
Thank you, Catherine.
Wes, you're muted.
Somehow I accidentally did that. Okay, thank you. We're going to jump into some result maps, and I just want you to keep in mind that these maps will be available for all 90+ species that Catherine just identified. So the first one is looking at our current conditions and thinking about suitability based off of those current conditions that Catherine just presented. 2 examples here that we will do throughout all of these example maps. First one being brown trout, classic introduced species from Europe, brought in for game opportunities within our cool and cold water systems. If you're looking at the map right now, on the left, you see those yellow areas down to teal, showing those high highly suitable areas, and they're everywhere we would expect for this kind of species in the Northeast and through the Appalachian Mountains. Alligator weed is on the contrasting side. This plant, non-native species, brought in, is abundant in the Southeast, spread very large and wide throughout and everywhere you would kind of think. So wonderful opposite um, um, taxa to show you the values of this map, taking in what we know currently and then projecting into the future. And the great thing about some of these resources that we have, it's wonderful to look at it at this scale because you can kind of see big patterns. But the great did it again. I don't know why it keeps doing that. We're also providing this information downscaled into so you can see those individual water bodies, those streams, those lakes, those reservoirs that Catherine was just pointing out. So you can not only see those large scale patterns across the landscape, across the state, across the entire region, but you also could scale it down to an individual water body to see that suitability that we're predicting. So a wonderful resource. And here's an example again, those brown trout in the Fingerling Lakes in New York. So everywhere we would kind of expect for this cool and cold water, very tolerant, very aggressive salmonid. So, so the current conditions, you could also see here an example for alligator weed. We picked a different area. Obviously, this is north of the Atlanta. And you can see the alligator weed widely spread not only in the large river systems in the this impounded river, but also in the smaller tributaries to that river. Okay, so now we take the next step. Where do we predict this to move into the future? And so this is looking at suitability and then change in that suitability. So first, let's think about future suitability. With these predictions, you could see some movements between what was previous. And don't worry, the next map will show more broadly those changes. But you can see that our cold and cool water species, not really expecting it to move further south, but you could see potentially new movements into unoccupied waters that are currently found. Alligator weed, on the other hand, we are showing some potential northward movement, especially on the Atlantic coast. You can see it moving up through the Chesapeake, again, with the suggestion of potentially a more warming conditions, providing the suitable conditions to allow alligator weed to make new habitats suitable. And again, same information, we will be able to downscale all those future conditions down to individual water bodies. Here's that same one with the brown trout. Doesn't look really different from maybe when I previously showed you. But you can see with the alligator weed in the Little Tennessee River, previously where it was more teal, so it's kind of a moderate suitability, we're showing it's kind of becoming higher in suitable as we predict those potential future conditions. So this is the one that I think most people are probably most interested is that change in suitability. So this is where we kind of highlight that change across the region. So the warmer the color, the redder is areas that we're showing that suitability alteration. And so this is really the information I think a lot of us want to show and think critically about. But we also have the contrast on this also. We could show areas where we're becoming less suitable. And so with those future climate change conditions, we do have the opportunity for habitat to become less suitable, and we've marked those with those darker blue colors on these maps. And agreement, this will be a wonderful opportunity in the near future for everybody to kind of delve into these individual species maps that we're going to provide out both on the NES database and of course within data releases. Okay, and here is kind of a generalization, bending that information into these categories of change. So moving from unsuitable all the way to increasing or decreasing suitability or just maintaining. So where it hasn't changed. And so with the brown trout, you can see there has some increased suitability, not really in the Northeast as it's well evaded there, maybe along the coast, as you can see there on the coast of Maine and coming down on the North Atlantic coast. But you can see new introduction potentials for the Western states. So it's actually an opposite direction. Whereas alligator weed, we are showing, like you saw on the previous map, a lot of increased suitability on the edge of its known range as conditions potentially change for it. So I'm going to hand this back over to Catherine, and we're going to do our first Padlet question.
Yeah, so we've put together some questions in the within Padlet, and I think someone's pasting the link into the chat. And if you click on that, you can go in and there's a list of questions there where we'd love your feedback on the maps that Wes presented, and if there's any other kinds of map products that you'd be interested or changes to what we proposed. And you don't have to have an account or anything. You can just click on the link and you can either you can upvote other people's suggestions, or you can write your own comments in there.
Catherine, are you watching the Padlet results?
Yes, it seems like people are still putting some information in there.
Perfect. I'm going to go back a map to respond to Tony Lynn's question about showing a map. Tony Lynn, was there a specific map?
And I think some of the questions we're getting in the Padlet relate to the next set of slides, so that's good. With hot spots and integrating with occurrences.
Yes.
Right, I think it's kind of slowed down, so maybe the Padlet will still be there, but we could let Wes move on with the next set.
All right. So I love that people are already thinking about this then. I haven't seen the Padlet results, but shifting hotspots. So we are interested in thinking critically about these locations with high risk of invasion or hotspots. And here's an example where Catherine has utilized terrestrial plant information to, well, it's not Catherine's work, it's Evan's and all, but Catherine used it as an example to show where hotspots of both current and future conditions with species abundance suitability. And so, yes, we're very interested in developing a very similar context, thinking about those locations where numerous species have the potential to co-occur into these locations. And when thinking about those hotspots, it's not just the current location, but the potential of the directionality of their movement. So here's another example of how hotspots can be represented with this black dot center showing the current condition of suitable habitat and the arrow showing a kind of future condition of suitable habitat. This is lovely in the sense it's very dynamic. It shows you a kind of shift in that center of suitability. And so you can see for some species in this example from, again, Evans et al., you can see very distinct long shifts where obviously the habitat suitability is increasing greatly and over a large region, and others that are kind of small and more discrete. And so these are two different ways that hotspots can be shown. And in the next Padlet question, we will ask preference on some of these, which ones you like better. So, Catherine, do you want to talk about pathways? Or was I was going to do this, wasn't I? Okay, I apologize. I'll just do it, and then Catherine can finish this out. So we're also very interested in pathways, especially with our aquatic species. Unlike terrestrial animals that have the ability just to walk across drainage divides, obviously aquatic had to have known ways of moving both human and natural. So human-mediated pathways like transport as hitchhiking on boats or trailers, or release from aquarium or aquaculture facilities. And so we're really curious about thinking critically about not only about the habitat that's suitable, but also how that potential animal or plant could get to that new location through those known pathways. And so we're creating this pathway assessment process where we're using identified known pathways of our introduced species, all 90 plus species that we identified through the models, and using landscape variables to assess that potential risk of that. And so a lot of these landscape variables are kind of surrogates for the known pathway, which we'll talk about, and then provide kind of a score of the risk of the water right through a summing process. So here are some of the examples of the aquatic invasion pathways. Some of these are general, but I think we can all agree these are known ways that things get around. So generally in a watershed, upward, downward movement through the drainage. Also hitchhiking, like I said, boats, trailers, equipment. It also could be kayaks, canoes. A hard one to deal with, hitchhiking on waterfowl, especially with plants. Release from or escape from captivity. This could be lots of measures, both water gardens, aquaculture, pet release, live bait. And then there's those natural movements, both in floodwaters or in canals and water pipes. And so we're taking all this in consideration. And what we are in the process of doing is taking the known pathways of each of our individual species. So here's a very general example of our species, taking those known pathways and then scoring those based off the watershed conditions using those landscape variables that we have defined to represent those pathways. This will allow us to come up with a general risk of the watershed score, with the idea being that the higher the number, the more ways a species could actually get to that water body. So it would be obviously more risky. So a great example here is we have hydrilla. Hydrilla, a menace, a big problem. Luckily, most of the Northeast has not had hydrilla, but it can move around in lots of different ways. And so we're showing an example here where the biggest difference between a lot of these watersheds is the ability for boats or trailers or equipment to get in and out of the water body. So boat ramps would be the landscape layer we'd use, and scoring again based on those landscape conditions. So more of a general risk assessment, not knowing exactly, there's no really kind of way of thinking critically about the actual known risk. Like we can't put a number to it, but we could assess at least the pathways that are known to move these species. All right, well, now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine. So go ahead, Catherine, jump in here.
All right, so one of the kind of last products that we're thinking about creating are kind of management summary tables, where we could take the information from those maps that we showed earlier and summarize that for each species, for each management area. We're thinking HUC-12s would be a good one. And create these tables that then can be used to help create prioritized lists of species, different types of watch lists, and we can integrate different types of information within these tables. So here's an example where you might have a list of all the species we modeled for a HUC. You could summarize the information from those maps to say what % of freshwater within this HUC-12 is suitable for a species, and thinking about current and future suitability, how much of it is always suitable, never suitable, maybe suitable only in the future, suitable now but not in the future. And then something about uncertainty. So if we're predicting that it's always suitable, we have those 5 different GCMs. So do they all agree that it's suitable, or did 2 of them say it was unsuitable and 3 of them said it was suitable? That could give people some feel for how uncertain those predictions are. And then we can also integrate that information, or that with information about whether or not the species has already been recorded in that area or not. So do we know it already occurs within that HUC-12, or is it not there yet? And so that's, a species that would be on a watch list. If it's not there yet, how many records are within 100 miles though? So it's nearby, so kind of at the doorstep of that unit. And then integrating also the pathway risk that Wes just showed from that previous table into this. Next slide. And so thinking about the different types of watch lists, you could come up with this. So again, you could have summaries by species. So you select, say, alligator weed, and you get summaries across all the HUC-12s, or you select a management area, so a specific HUC-12, and you could come up with a ranked watch list, or you could get summarized information of kind of the hotspots of future invasion across HUCs. And then there's different ways that you could filter the data. So thinking of that invaders at the doorstep concept. So what species have predicted suitability within a HUC-12, but they haven't yet been recorded within that HUC-12, but maybe they're within 50 miles of there, or 100 miles, so they're already nearby. Or thinking about more kind of regional EDRR activities. So what species maybe don't have any records within the entire watershed yet, but they have predicted suitability there? And then are there pathway risks to get to that location? Next slide. And this is just an example of that concept for counties in New York for terrestrial plant species. And so this is a map showing numerically the number of species in these different categories, but there'd be a list of those species underlying each of those counties that you could get. And so how many species have suitability of the ones that have been modeled? How many species have suitability but haven't been recorded there yet? In the top right, how many species are at the doorstep? So again, have suitability there, haven't been recorded within the unit, but are within 100 miles. And then how many species have suitability but haven't been recorded in that entire region? Next slide. And so we'd like to get even more of your input. So we've put together another set of Padlet questions that kind of relate to this last suite of slides, with thinking about hotspots and the pathway analysis integrating with the suitability models and these kind of summary table pieces. And the link has been pasted into the chat for everybody.
And just as Tony Lynn asked last time, if there's a map or image you'd like to go back to, just throw it into the chat, and I'm happy to oblige.
All right, I think it's slowed down again in the Padlet, so we'll leave that up. But I think that's pretty much everything. So people can continue to respond to either Padlets, but we can also open it up for questions, I think.